Hi, I'm Howard and welcome to my channel. Recently on my blog I posted an image that had an ethereal glow or an ethereal look to it, and people had mentioned that they would like to see how that look was achieved. So I said I would make a tutorial, and this is that tutorial. Now before we get into the video, I'd just like to say that if you enjoy content like this and find it useful, that I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel and possibly giving the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it. Let's get to the video. So let's jump right in and have a look at how I achieved this ethereal look in this image. Someone might call it an ethereal glow, but this is the image I had used in the blog post. And as you can see here, I have several folders. One is called Pre-Glow Processing, the second is called Glow Group, and the third is called Post-Glow Processing. Let's turn them off for a moment. And what we see here is the image as it came out of Lightroom into Photoshop. So the Pre-Glow Processing folder just contains layers that I used in Photoshop and also with a couple plugins to process the image further to make it look the way I wanted it to look, to improve its appearance. And there's really no need to go through these because that's not the subject of this particular tutorial. These are just routine Photoshop adjustments to bring the image looking like this. This is not the quote ethereal glow, but this is in this folder right here. And if we turn on this folder, we will see that effect applied to the image. And that is the effect that gives it the so-called ethereal look. In this particular folder, again, I wanted to bring the image a little further after it came through the glow processing and mold it into what I wanted it to look like. And again, these are just routine Photoshop layers. You know, some are applied to the whole image, some are targeted towards specific areas of the image, but it brought the photo to the final look I wanted to give it. So I'm going to turn these off because, or at least this particular folder off, because this is really immaterial to the tutorial of how to get this sort of look. So let's have a peek and see what's inside this glow group. And surprisingly, it consists of only 2 layers. And it's really easy to do, and I'm going to show you the specifics right now. But I do want to say I didn't devise this look. I actually learned it from photographer Jim Welninski. He has an amazing array of courses and tutorials available on his website, and I'm going to leave a link to his website up above. So what I'm going to do at this point is close this folder, turn that group off, and we're going to reconstruct what I did in this group from scratch to show you how to do it. All right, then let's get to it. The first thing we're going to do is make 2 stamped layers. All right, so what's a stamped layer? A stamped layer is simply a layer that contains the entire image with all the adjustments below it. So we have this top active group or layer highlighted, and we're going to make our first stamp layer, and this should be highlighted so that the layer goes right above it. If I had a different layer highlighted, the stamp layer would go wherever it's highlighted. So in other words, if I had this highlighted, the stamp layer would be between the 2. We don't want that. We want the stamp layer on top. We highlight this and make our first stamped layer. All right, how do we make this so-called stamped layer? On a Windows machine, you do it by pressing Alt, Control, Shift, E. And as you can see, it's given us the image with all the modifications made to it up to that point on a layer of its own. On a Mac, you can do the same thing by pressing, I believe it's Shift, Command, Option, and E all at the same time. These keyboard shortcuts are really the easiest way to do it. So there's our first stamp layer. and it's highlighted. So now I'm going to make a second stamp layer by pressing, again, this is a Windows machine, Alt, Control, Shift, and E all at once. And there is our second stamp layer. What I am now going to do, that was invasive. What I'm now going to do is highlight this first stamp layer, and I'm going to blur it. And I am going to do that by coming up here and going to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And you have to choose a radius. So what to choose? Well, a good starting point, or a good point, is to choose the number of megapixels in your camera. So I had taken this with a 5 DSR, which is approximately 50 megapixels. If this had come up to something different, all I would have to do is highlight that and type 50 in there. And this is going to blur with a radius of 50 pixels. And we click OK. We don't see any changes because above it is another layer that has not been blurred yet. And we are now going to blur that layer. And we are going to blur it once again. Blur, Gaussian blur, and again with the same radius of 50 pixels. We click OK. And now we have a blur on each of the two stamp layers that we made. I'm now going to go to the first stamp layer and change the blending mode. The default, of course, is normal. I am going to change the blending mode here to screen. Then I'm going to go to the layer above it that's also been blurred. Again, default is normal. And I'm going to change this blending mode to multiply. And what you can see is we're starting to get that effect. Now, you know, the opacity is at 100% for each layer. It is overdone, and it doesn't look so hot. But the idea now is to go to each layer. For example, let's turn this one off, and the screen blurred layer obviously brightens everything up because it's got a screen blend mode. And we're going to play with the opacity until it comes looking something that we might like. Let's just say there, because the next layer, the darken blurred layer, the multiply blurred layer, is going to darken things up. Let's turn that back on, and let's decrease, go to that layer and decrease the opacity of that layer as well, until it starts to look a bit like we might like it to look. And there we've really achieved the effect that I have shown in the image. Now, it's sometimes useful to group these things and put them into a folder like I did here called Glow Group. The way to do that is simply to highlight both layers. We have this one highlighted. I'm going to press Shift and click on this to highlight this one, and come down here and click on the folder icon. And now they're both in this group called Group 1. We can change the name by double clicking on it and just typing in Glow Group. Now you'll notice in my original Glow Group there's a mask, and the reason I did that is the eye tends to go to the sharpest area of the image first, and I wanted to lead the viewer through the image across this bridge and up the stairs, so I took some of the effect off of this pathway that I wanted the viewer's eye to go through. And you know, we can borrow this mask, and by holding down Alt, drag it down to our new Glow Group, and you can see some of that effect is removed from this area and the pathway. And now I'll just turn on our post-glow processing, which I did, and we have our finished image. So I do want to give you two little caveats. The first is that once you have achieved within these two layers the specific opacities that you'd like, and of course you can always come back and play with each individual opacity, but once you have a ratio between the screen and the multiply, layers that you like, you can actually highlight the entire glow group and change the opacity of the entire effect without affecting the ratio between the multiply and screen layer. So obviously if we turn this off all the way to 0, we have no effect, and we can go anywhere in between, to alter the overall application of the effect to the image to taste. The second caveat has to do with the Gaussian blur of the layers. Now, when we made the Gaussian blur to 50, a radius of 50, and then said OK, that degree of blur is fixed. But let's say you want to try fine-tuning, or you're someone that would like to experiment. Well, when we come down here and we make our stamp layer, if one wants to, before you blur it, you can right-click on the layer and convert it to a smart object. And that little icon in the corner indicates that it's a smart object. Now, if we go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, 50, we've blurred our layer. And again, we would make 2 layers just like I showed before. We make 2 of these, one for screen and one for multiply. But if you come back, in this case, and click on the Gaussian blur, you can actually change that radius setting. Click OK. And so you can play around with the amount of radius on each of the layers, make some fine adjustments and experiment. I typically don't do this, but you certainly can do that if you really want to play around with this look. Well, I hope you found that information useful. And again, if you enjoy content like this, I would appreciate your subscribing to the channel. And we'll see you next time.